The winter of 1771 lay heavy over Stockholm. The streets were frozen, the royal palace shrouded in silence, its chambers warmed by fire but haunted by discontent. Adolf Fredrik, King of Sweden, sat upon the throne, yet in truth he was no ruler of men. The power of Sweden had slipped long ago into the hands of the Riksdag, the parliament that shackled the monarchy with laws and compromises. He was a king without authority, a figure crowned but bound, a man whose decisions rarely outlived his own breath. And so, where others might have turned to war, or reform, or religion to fill the void, Adolf Fredrik turned to something far more indulgent: food. It was at the table, not in the council chamber, that he claimed his dominion. In feasts and in banquets, among silver trays of roasted meats, delicate pastries and rivers of wine, the king reigned supreme. Where he could not order generals, he ordered dishes. Where he could not command armies, he commanded his cooks. But indulgence, when unchecked, becomes a tyrant greater than any parliament. And Adolf Fredrik, trapped between humiliation and hunger, yielded to it again and again. His body swelled, his frame grew heavy, his spirit dulled. Yet he ate, as though consuming could compensate for the throne that had slipped from his grasp. And on that fateful February night, the hunger that had defined his reign became the hunger that would end his life. Because at the king's table was prepared a feast so rich, so grotesque, that it would etch his name into history, not for laws passed, not for wars fought, but for the manner in which he died, a death by banquet, a monarch consumed by consumption itself. And so the scene was set, not for battle, not for treason, but for a meal that would become a tomb. February 12th, 1771. The long dining hall of the palace gleamed with golden candlelight. Shadows stretched across walls lined with portraits of ancestors who had fought wars, brokered alliances, built empires. But on this night, their descendants sought neither glory nor power, only pleasure. The table groaned beneath the weight of food. Course after course, the servants brought forth dishes so excessive they seemed more like offerings to a god than sustenance for a single man. First came platters of lobster, their shells cracked open to reveal flesh glistening with butter, salmon smoked to a rich perfection, trout stuffed with herbs, and bowls of caviar crowned the feast. The king's fingers, heavy with jeweled rings, plucked morsels with an eagerness that ignored both etiquette and caution. Next arrived roasted meats, game birds, beef, venison, cut and seasoned in the kitchens, piled high until the juices bled into one another. Wines of the Rhine, strong and sweet, poured endlessly into the king's goblet. But it was not the meat nor the wine that sealed Adolf Fredrik's fate. It was dessert, the king's favorite dish, semla, sweet rolls stuffed with almond paste, drowned in scalding milk. A delicacy of Sweden's Shrove Tuesday, meant to be enjoyed sparingly. Adolf Fredrik did not enjoy them sparingly. He devoured them, one roll, then another, then another. His courtiers counted in silence, glancing nervously at one another as the monarch consumed 10, 12, 14. Still, he did not stop. Each semla was heavier than the last, the almond paste rich, the milk thick and cloying. By the time he reached 16, his face was flushed. His breath came ragged, his body straining under the mountain of food he had forced upon himself. And yet, when a servant timidly asked if he wished the feast to end, the king waved him off with a gesture as imperious as any royal command. More. 17. 18. He drank champagne to wash them down. The bubbles rose in his gut like fire. The food within him churned, swelling, pressing against his ribs, against his lungs. The courtiers tried to look away, tried to pretend that what they witnessed was not grotesque, not obscene. But the truth was undeniable. The King of Sweden was devouring himself into the grave. By the time the last morsel vanished, Adolf Fredrik sat slumped in his chair, eyes glazed, a sheen of sweat upon his forehead. He had conquered the banquet, but in doing so, he had declared war upon his own body, and it was a war he would not win. The candles flickered in the vast hall, casting grotesque shadows across walls that had once borne witness to law, diplomacy, and ceremony. but now they watched only suffering, a monarch undone by his own excess. Adolf Frederick remained seated, his body rigid, a subtle tremor coursing through him. At first the courtiers thought it fatigue. Then came the moans, deep, guttural, a sound not of a man speaking, but of a creature overfilled, struggling to contain what should never have been contained. The food, 16 semler, lobsters, game, caviar, wine, and champagne, had become a monstrous mass. It pressed against every organ, every vessel, every breath. The king's chest heaved violently. He clutched his stomach, but no hand, no physician, no prayer could reverse the carnage within. The royal physicians gathered, their faces pale under the candlelight, their hands trembling. They probed, pressed, whispered remedies of the era, emetics, poultices, warm baths, but the damage was total. The body, stretched beyond the natural limit, had begun to fail in ways that words can barely describe. Breath became labor, pulse flickered like a dying flame. The king moaned, then whimpered, then collapsed slightly sideways, as though gravity itself recoiled from the weight he carried inside. Each movement expelled a grotesque, audible protest from his stomach, and the sound echoed through the hall like a macabre drumbeat, marking the final hours of Sweden's sovereign. Some courtiers fainted. Others turned their faces, unwilling to witness the grotesque unraveling of a man who had once been king. But none could leave. None could act. For in that moment, death was a spectacle, and the monarch's suffering was the court's burden. And so the night passed in horror, each hour heavier than the last, until at last, in the small hours of February 12th, 1771, the end came not with a whisper, but with a rupture, a cataclysm that seemed to defy the bounds of human anatomy. Adolf Frederick, King of Sweden, died. Some accounts say the term exploding was used, not in the dramatic sense of a firework or bomb, but as a morbid shorthand for the sudden, violent, irreversible collapse of a body destroyed from within. The courtiers recoiled. The physicians fell silent. The palace itself seemed to shudder under the grotesque absurdity of a king undone by what should have been pleasure. The throne, once a symbol of power, sat empty. Sweden had lost its monarch not to war, not to plague, not to revolution, but to indulgence taken beyond human limits. And in that emptiness, the absurdity of the event settled into history, a sovereign whose final act was to eat, and in eating, to die spectacularly, grotesquely, inevitably. The morning after, Stockholm awoke to whispers that shivered through the streets like cold wind. The news of the king's death spread faster than any courier could gallop, and the story that emerged was at once tragic and grotesquely absurd. Adolf Frederick, sovereign of Sweden, had perished not upon the battlefield, not in a duel of states, not in the machinations of Parliament, but under the weight of his own feast. Citizens spoke in hushed tones. Some laughed nervously at the notion that a king could die from indulgence. Others shivered with horror, imagining the agony, imagining the grotesque final moments of a man who had consumed 16 semler, lobsters, wine, and champagne in a single sitting. The palace corridors, once echoing with ceremony, became corridors of silence. Courtiers and servants alike recoiled from both the stench of excess and the shadow of mortality that now lingered over the throne. The Riksdag moved quickly, as if to reassert authority over a kingdom whose sovereign had been so spectacularly humbled. Discussions of succession, regency, and national stability consumed the chambers that had once been alive with the pomp of courtly life. And yet, beneath the official proceedings, a subtle, grim amusement persisted, a darkly human recognition of the irony. A king, stripped of power during life, undone by indulgence in death. Artists, chroniclers, and satirists seized upon the tale, etching images and verses that captured the grotesque excess of Adolf Frederick's final banquet. Some portrayed him reclining among dishes, eyes wide, hands clutching morsels, the very image of gluttony. Others imagined his spirit wandering the palace halls, forever tethered to the table that had betrayed him, a cautionary figure for kings and commoners alike. Yet beneath the comedy, there was also a haunting truth. The death of Adolf Frederick revealed a deeper fragility in human desire. A monarch, deprived of true power, turned to pleasure as an act of self-assertion, and in doing so, consumed himself utterly. The event became not merely a story of absurdity, but a meditation on the vulnerabilities of both rulers and men, how obsession with indulgence, the hunger for control or satisfaction, can metastasize into destruction, indifferent to lineage, title or crown. In the years that followed, Sweden would remember Adolf Frederick not as a warrior, not as a legislator, not as a statesman, but as a cautionary figure, the king undone by a feast, the man who ate himself to death while history watched in awe, disbelief, and dark fascination. History has a way of immortalizing the grotesque, of allowing absurdity to outlast ambition. Adolf Frederick, King of Sweden, became more than a footnote of mortality. He became a symbol, a warning etched in memory of the fragility of flesh, of desire, of human limits. In death, he embodied a paradox, sovereign in title, powerless in life, yet spectacularly sovereign in the final act of excess that claimed him. The palace, emptied of its monarch, seemed to carry a lingering echo of that final feast. Chairs pushed back, silver trays still glimmering under the candlelight, the faint scent of almonds and butter clinging to the air, remnants of a king's indulgence and reminders of human vulnerability to appetite unchecked by reason. Courtiers would speak of the event with a mixture of horror and incredulity, a story that defied the gravitas usually reserved for kings. Yet even in its absurdity, it revealed truths deeper than pomp or decree, that the body has limits, that the mind can be enslaved by pleasure, and that no crown can grant immunity to the inevitabilities of flesh and fate. Philosophers would later remark that the king's death was a darkly poetic lesson, an allegory of excess and mortality. While nations wage wars, plot revolutions, and negotiate treaties, the most formidable power a man can wield over his life remains elusive: self-restraint. Adolf Frederick's final moments illustrated how indulgence, when weaponized against one's own body, can render the mighty powerless, the regal grotesque, the sovereign a spectacle. And so, centuries later, when historians recount his death, when storytellers animate the candles, the silver trays, the 16 semla, it is not merely for morbid fascination. It is to bear witness to the fragile intersection of desire, corporeal limitation, and human folly. It is to understand that even kings, men elevated above the masses by birth, ceremony, and ambition, remain subject to the universal laws of body and mind, and that sometimes the most extraordinary catastrophes are born not of battle, rebellion, or treason, but of the simple, timeless hunger that defines us all. Adolf Frederick's name persists not in deeds of governance or conquest, but in the story of a man who ate himself to death, a grotesque, haunting, unforgettable warning to rulers, courtiers, and commoners alike. In this, he achieved a form of immortality, one less regal than intended, yet impossible to ignore. The crown lies empty, the table bears witness, and history whispers the dark lesson. Even the mighty can be undone by what they most crave.